This is something that happened to me a few years ago. I'm finally beginning to feel comfortable enough sharing it with others, although it has prevented me from taking any vacation since. Some background information. I was the firstborn in my family. I have a younger sister who was born almost exactly 3 years after me. When we were younger, it seemed like my family would go on vacation almost once every year. This story took place when I was 22 and just recently graduated from college with a 4-year degree. My parents decided we were going to celebrate. They were planning a cruise for the two of them, but given my recent graduation, they decided to turn it into a family event and invited my sister and I along. Up until this point, I was used to going on standard vacations around the country by going to the basic spots with oceans and boardwalks, and then after a week we would go home. So the idea of going on a 2-week cruise and visiting all sorts of exotic places seemed very exciting to me. I cleared my schedule and was packed and ready to go days before we were set to leave. Eventually the day came, and we boarded our plane to be flown down to where we were set to board our cruise. It was shocking as soon as I got off the plane. The heat and humidity. It's like after a 4-hour plane ride, I went from dead winter to blistering summer. It was amazing. I can still feel the heat and picture the smell of that summer air. My excitement level was as high as ever. I only wish I knew what was in store for me next. After waiting several hours, it was finally time to board the cruise ship. The ship was amazing. My parents really went all out. My parents had gotten us 2 rooms, one for them and one for my sister and I. The rooms were way nicer than what I had been anticipating. The first night was great. We all ate dinner at the cruise. Again, way above expectations. After retiring to bed, I had planned to meet my parents for breakfast in the morning. Being me, I slept in a tad later than planned. Still, I went to go find my parents anyway. My sister said she wasn't feeling well and chose to stay in bed. I told her I hoped she felt better soon and was off to meet my parents. First, I stopped by their room, but it seemed they had already left to go get breakfast. Next, I headed to the dining hall to meet them there, but upon arriving to the dining hall, they were nowhere in sight. I asked around to a few of the cruise employees to see if any of them had seen my parents or knew their whereabouts. Finally, I found an employee who said they remembered my parents asking if they could see a nurse on board since they weren't feeling well. Great, it looks like I'm the only one who isn't under the weather. I wanted to go check on my parents, but I had a difficult finding anyone who could direct me to the cruise nurse. Finally, one employee instructed me to go down to the ship's lower level to find the nurse's office, hastily giving me directions, which I struggled to remember. I headed down to the lower level and found myself wandering through dark, dingy hallways. There were doors throughout the hallways, but all of them were unmarked, not saying where they headed or what was inside. Plus, it looked dark in the rooms. I continued to walk through the seemingly endless hallways and corridors as I suddenly got the sense someone was following me. It was just a feeling I had, which I quickly brushed off as nothing. Well, that was until I began hearing footsteps. But as soon as I would stop and turn around, the footsteps would stop, and I never saw anyone. I decided I was just being paranoid. As soon as I was about to give up and head upstairs, I found a door labeled nurse. Nothing else, just nurse. I walked up to the door and knocked. I knocked again, and again once more. I decided no one was in there and was ready to walk away. Then suddenly, I heard a noise coming from inside. So I knocked again, saying, "Hello, is anyone in there?" I got no response from anyone. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I cautiously walked inside to discover no one inside. I decided to take a look around, and what I found both shocked and disgusted me. Within these old metal shelves were dozens of jars. They were small, but appeared to hold some type of body parts and some type of liquid. I didn't stick around long enough to closely examine what was inside these jars. I ran out of that room and began running down the halls, looking for any way to get back upstairs. If something had happened to my parents, I had to find my sister right away. Once I finally found my way upstairs, I made it back to my sister and I's room. I busted inside, and to my surprise, she was sitting there in her bed. Not only that, but my parents were in the room with her. They all apologized to me, saying that they were all under the weather after eating and decided our vacation had to be cut short. I didn't want to end up acting freaked out in case I had really no reason to be, but I had no objection to leaving early. Our family left the next morning and headed home. Several days later, my family began feeling better, and everything seemed like it was just me making something out of nothing. That was until I saw the news a couple days later. It turns out, several other couples began feeling ill after eating on the cruise. Out of those 6 people, 4 were reported missing, and authorities suspected they jumped overboard. They said this was caused by their illness. The last couple was found dead in their room. It was suspected they ingested high levels of shellfish at the dinner, not knowing they were allergic, and died in their sleep later that night. Of course, after my discovery in the lower level, I still have my suspicions that something more heinous was going on. I called what I believed to be the proper authorities, but never heard anything back. This will be the last time I ever go on a cruise. And if you're considering going, just make sure to keep your guard up. This is a true story that happened to me when I was 17 years old. My family decided to go on summer vacation since it had been so many years since our last trip. My parents researched different destinations and found a house we could rent in the Outer Banks of South Carolina for a reasonable price. We decided we would drive there since we were only coming from Ohio. It was by no means a short drive, but my parents decided it would make more sense than paying for round-trip plane tickets. Plus, we could visit any destinations we wanted to, since we would have our car with us. I spent a couple days making a list of everything I would need to pack once the time for the trip drew near. Eventually, we were all packed and ready to go. The trip down wasn't too bad. It was pretty boring, and I had a difficult time finding a comfortable position to sleep in. Once we were finally about to arrive to the rental house, my dad pulled over and offered to let me drive the rest of the way. Newly having my license, this was a pretty big deal to me. As we got closer and closer to our destination, we started to look around all the different attractions, trying to take mental notes of the things we wanted to do while we were there. At last, we arrived at the small beach village where our rental house was. My dad headed into the office to get the keys, while the rest of us waited in the car. Several minutes later, he returned with the keys and a small map of how to navigate our way through the small village. When we got to our house, we were all pretty pleasantly surprised. It was actually quite nice, and even bigger than it looked in the pictures. We couldn't wait to get inside. Once inside, my brother and I, who was 2 years younger than I am, both raced upstairs to claim our rooms. All the bedrooms were nice, so we didn't end up getting into a fight over who gets what room. By the time we got settled in, it was beginning to get dark out. Although I was rather exhausted, I really wanted to go see the beach. Being a 17-year-old girl, my parents said the only way I could go walk on the beach is if I brought my brother and a flashlight. He was just as excited and agreed to go with me. My brother and I walked out the back door of the house and down through the narrow walkway to the beach. By this time, it was mostly unoccupied, with random people scattered around here and there. We walked down to the water and kicked off our flip-flops. We decided to carry them and walk barefoot. I can still remember the feeling on my feet walking in the damp sand. There were other couples walking down the beach. Most had flashlights as well. We were enjoying ourselves until suddenly someone had directed their flashlight right on us. Being blinded by the light, we couldn't see who it was, but noticed the light getting closer and closer. The next thing I knew, we were standing right in front of 2 guys. They were very tan and looked to be in their late 20s. They didn't come across in an aggressive or intimidating way, but I still felt a bit unsettled. They asked us, "Are you guys here on vacation?" I replied, "Yes, we just got here a couple hours ago." The other guy replied, "This is a very nice place to visit, at least during the daytime, but be careful wandering around at night. A lot of the locals that live here are very poor, and seeing rich vacationers makes them angry. They often target those from out of town and rob them." It seemed like he was trying to give me genuine advice, but I still got a very weird feeling from him. I said, "Thanks, I appreciate the advice. Well, we better get back so our parents don't worry." The man told us to enjoy our trip as my brother and I quickly walked away, heading back to our rental house. Once we were back, I decided I would call it a night and try to get some sleep. After that drive and walking on the beach, I fell asleep so quickly I could barely remember laying my head down on my pillow. The next thing I remember is having some weird dream that involved loud banging noises. The noises were so loud that I seemed to wake myself up. Once I realized I was awake, I decided to check my phone to see what time it was, since it was still dark out. Just then, the door to my room came busting open. I let out a small shriek and was relieved to see it was just my dad. He first asked me what I was doing awake, and I told him I was woken up by a weird dream. He then asked me if I was making any loud noises or had heard anything. I told him no and asked him what he was talking about. He said he heard something coming from my room, something that sounded like some sort of hammering noise. We both brushed it off as nothing, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I got out of bed and went downstairs to join my family for breakfast. After eating, we decided we would all go to the beach for the day. It was great, swimming, sun, and just relaxing. Eventually, we grew tired and decided to go home. Upon returning home, we started to notice some strange things. We noticed some small things missing. My bottle of Gatorade I had in the fridge was gone. Also missing were a few food items, and even our toothpaste. My dad checked his nightstand where his wallet was, and to our surprise, it was still there, along with the money in it. My dad decided to err on the side of caution and called the police to make a report. About 45 minutes later, an officer showed up. He inspected the house and said there was no sign of a break-in, and since nothing of real value was missing, he decided to not make a report, but told us to call again if anything else suspicious occurred. The next couple days were pretty normal, just regular, fun vacation stuff. Then, one night we all decided we'd go out for dinner. It was great. Some of the food down there is simply amazing. When we got home, I just remember my brother saying, "Oh no, it happened again." He immediately noticed that his flip-flops that he left next to the door were gone. My dad told us to all wait by the door. We waited as he went from room to room, making sure that no one was in the house. Once he said that there was no one there, we all proceeded to look around to see what else might be missing. Once again, we were all left confused when we discovered more items gone. This time, it appeared the thief had taken more food items, bottles of water, and it appeared that many of our items had been moved around. Again, my dad called the police to report what had happened. This time, the officer that showed up decided to file a report. We assured him that all the doors and windows were locked before we left, but again, there was no sign of a break-in. So once again, we were told to call them again if anything else happened or came up missing. I went to bed feeling a little unsettled that night. I had a hard time sleeping, so I laid in bed texting my friend from back home about what had been going on. As I was typing a text back to my friend, my phone slipped out of my hand and fell to the ground. I reached down off the bed, trying to find it on the floor, but I couldn't find it. So I turned on the light next to my bed and got down on my hands and knees on the floor looking around for it. Suddenly, I got that weird feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, but then I looked up, and through the air vent in my wall, I saw the face of a man staring back at me. He looked as scared to see me as I was to see him. At that moment, I let out a scream so loud the neighbors probably heard it. Seconds later, my mom and dad rushed into my room, asking me what was wrong. I told them what I had just seen. They asked me if I was sure it wasn't just a dream. I assured them that it wasn't. I told them that I hadn't even gone to sleep yet. My dad called the police and informed them of what I saw. Minutes later, the police arrived. After a thorough search of the house, they found a man hiding in the crawl space underneath the house. Apparently, the man could gain access to the ventilation system through the crawl space, and from there could actually get into the home. The police informed us we weren't the first people this had happened to. The man that was caught was homeless. He had been arrested in the past for similar crimes. Typically, he hides in areas of houses that no one goes into, and when no one is home, he eats their food, uses their restrooms, and does whatever else he has to, just in order to survive. Although the man was arrested and removed from the house, we still didn't feel comfortable there and cut our vacation short. When we got back to our home in Ohio, we made sure to block off all of our vents with furniture, probably out of pure paranoia. Although no one was hurt, and the homeless man didn't do anything heinous to any of us, this was still by far the scariest thing I've ever been through. Back in the summer of 2013, I went on a vacation that forever changed me. My best friend Michael and I were set on to go on a vacation with our girlfriends. Michael was a few years older than me. The girl he'd been dating for a few years was named Ashley, and I'd been dating Ashley's younger sister Morgan for about a year at this point. I had friends whose parents owned a rental home just outside of Miami, so I was able to get the four of us hooked up with a pretty cheap vacation to Florida. As the time drew near for us to head to Florida, Michael became sick, and I mean really sick. So sick that he ended up in the hospital. He was diagnosed with pneumonia. The doctor said he would be fine in time, but Michael said he was in no condition to travel. Ashley said she would stay behind with him, but Michael continually insisted that she went on the vacation with Morgan and I. We all kind of felt weird and guilty about it, but we finally agreed. Michael told me to keep an eye on Ashley in a half-joking, half-serious kind of way. Since the cost of our rental home was so low, we were fortunate enough to be able to afford plane tickets to Florida. They were non-refundable, which I'm sure is another reason Michael insisted that Ashley go. The flight was smooth and we arrived in Florida around 6 p.m. We took a taxi to our rental home, and by around 8 p.m. or so, we were all settled in. We decided to go out that night and just walk around and see what we could find. I felt extra protective over the girls. Not only was I being protective over my own girlfriend like normal, but I also had to watch over her older sister, who also happened to be dating my best friend. Since we were in a suburb outside of Miami, there wasn't much excitement going on. Our vacation house was dead set in old people country. Still, we had a blast, just running around without a care in the world, full of that feeling of having no responsibilities while being on vacation. We decided that when we got back to our vacation house, we would look into some more exciting destinations and take a taxi into Miami the next night. The house was great. We all slept well and went to the beach in the morning. We swam a bit and the girls spent what felt like an eternity laying out in the sun. Finally, we went home, showered, and began getting ready for our night out. The taxi arrived, and after 15 minutes of driving, we ended up in a whole different world than what we were in the night before. There were people everywhere, lights, bars, music. We got out of the taxi and began walking down the street. This is when I started to become uncomfortable for the first time. Not to toot my own horn, but both my girlfriend and her older sister are very attractive girls. Plus, they were extra dressed up this particular night. What made the situation worse is that there were two girls and then just me. So this gave random guys the idea that Ashley was single. Throughout the night, we bar hopped a bit and got haggled a little, but nothing serious. I could barely enjoy myself. I felt like I had to keep myself prepared to be ready to fight at any time. Finally, we ended up at a bar that was really laid back. It wasn't full of douchebags and skanks. It was more nerdy, hipster-type people. There was a decent indie band playing. No one was coming over to hit on Ashley or Morgan. I finally felt like I could relax and just enjoy myself. The next thing I know, we are hanging out with two other couples who were friends. They said they too were on vacation. We sat together at a table and talked for a couple hours. We were all really having a good time. We all eventually became rather intoxicated, and eventually Morgan asked me to go with her to watch the band and dance. Dancing is something I would normally never do, but I was pretty drunk, and I really wanted Morgan to have a good time. She asked Ashley to come with us, but Ashley said she wanted to continue talking to the girl she was sitting next to. I don't recall this girl's name. Morgan and I proceeded through the tables and walked into the area where the band was playing. We danced around together, mostly making fools out of ourselves, but we had a great time. A few other couples even joined in on the fun. After about 20 minutes, the set ended and we decided to head back to our table. As soon as we came around the corner and walked back into the area with all the tables, we stopped dead in our tracks and looked at each other in confusion. Everyone from our table was gone. Ashley, the two other couples, just gone. Their drinks were still on the tables. We both expressed our what the fuck comments to one another, but panic hadn't quite set in yet at that point. We had assumed they must have just gone somewhere else in the bar. It was a larger venue. There was the main bar area with tables and booths where we had originally been sitting. There was a room with a stage where the bands played. They even had a room with dozens of beanbag chairs and TVs. Surely they must have been somewhere else within the bar. We quickly checked out each section of the bar, even the bathrooms. Ashley, along with the couples we had been sitting with, were nowhere in sight. We asked the bartender if she recalled seeing where they left to. She told us that the blonde girl, Ashley, appeared to have not been feeling well, and her friends helped her out the door. The bartender said it appeared that Ashley had too much to drink and needed help leaving the bar and getting home. I can remember at that very moment, my heart completely sank. I tried staying positive for Morgan's sake, suggesting that maybe our new friends had helped Ashley by driving her back to the rental house. By this point, Morgan was already on the phone trying to call Ashley. The first 2 times she called Ashley's phone, it rang several times and then went to voicemail. The 3rd time she called, along with each attempt after that, it went straight to voicemail, as if she had turned her phone off. That's when the true panic set in. We didn't know whether or not we should start searching the streets or head back to the rental house to see if she actually had made it home by some miracle. We left the bar and started running around the immediate area, looking for any sign of Ashley. After about a half hour of this, not only were we lost, but we decided that if she was taken, she was long gone by now. We decided the best thing to do was just call a taxi and have them find us. There was still the chance that Ashley had ended up back at the rental house. The ride back seemed to go on for an eternity, and once we finally arrived there, our worst fears were realized. Ashley was nowhere in sight. The house was just as we left it. Morgan immediately called the police and described to them what had happened. They told her this kind of thing happens all the time, and that Ashley probably just decided to go hang out somewhere else with her new friends. Regardless of how much Morgan pleaded and told them that Ashley would never do that, they said they couldn't consider her a missing person until she was missing for at least 24 hours. The next 24 hours were a nightmare. No sleep, no Ashley, nothing. We were finally able to make a police report. Michael called me asking why Ashley's phone was off. I had to tell him the truth. Eventually Michael flew down to try to figure out what was going on. Then Morgan and Ashley's parents came down as well. Days went by and we made zero progress. Finally, our vacation time came to an end, and the police still had made no progress. I couldn't afford to stay in Florida any longer, plus I had to go back to work. I believe Michael and Morgan stayed an additional week after I left. Morgan and Ashley's parents stayed for a long time. I'm not sure why they stayed so long. Maybe just to be closer to their daughter. Or maybe because they felt like by coming home, they were giving up on her. Days turned into weeks, which turned into months. Eventually, Ashley was presumed dead, and we held a small funeral for her. It was just a horrible, sad situation. Morgan was never the same after, and Michael basically blamed me for everything. To be honest, I really blame myself a lot too. I should have never let her out of my sight. So fast forward roughly 2 years after Ashley first disappeared. I was sitting at home after work one night and was just messing around on Facebook. Suddenly, I realized that the green dot was next to Ashley's name, indicating that she was online. I immediately called Morgan and asked her if she knew her login info. Morgan said that no one else would know her Facebook password, except for her. She began to freak out a bit over this, but we ended up agreeing it was probably just a glitch. We soon forgot about the incident until about a month later, something weird happened again. Morgan's mom received a phone call from a weird number. She answered the phone and heard no one on the other line. She was getting ready to hang up when suddenly she heard people faintly talking in the background. This is where everything changed. She had assumed someone accidentally dialed her number. That was until she heard a familiar voice. It was Ashley. She was talking to someone. Her mom recalled that she sounded like she was specifically talking loud. She even went out of her way to make herself known by asking whoever she was talking to if they liked the name Ashley or if she looked like an Ashley. Her mom said she heard some sort of a scuffle, and then the line hung up. Obviously being floored by this, she immediately went to the police to let them know what happened. Halfway across the country from Florida, the police were less than helpful and quickly dismissed Morgan's mom and her claims. To make a long story short, Morgan and Ashley's parents went through a lot of legal proceedings and obtained a lot of legal help. And eventually, a judge granted that the information regarding that phone number to be subpoenaed. As it would turn out, that number was no longer in use, but the police were able to obtain a list of phone numbers that whoever was using that phone was in contact with. It seemed to take quite some time, but eventually, several of those phone numbers were able to lead the authorities to a specific location. It was a residence being used as a brothel. For years, girls, mostly tourists to Miami, were being abducted and forced into sex slavery. Despite us having a funeral for Ashley, miraculously, she was found alive at the brothel that was discovered. She was in awful condition, very malnourished, and even worse, addicted to a variety of drugs. The weird thing was, it was like she wasn't even excited to see them. And when I say them, it was her parents and her sister that went down to get her. Michael had since moved on, and it didn't feel appropriate for me to go, although I was still dating Morgan at this point. Her parents got her home safely. From what I heard, there was another dozen girls in that house, all reported missing weeks, months, or even years ago. The worst part of this to me is that it wasn't just guys that did this to her. There were girls with the guy that took her. Human trafficking is a real thing in the US, trust me. I spent countless time looking into it prior to us finding Ashley. It breaks my heart to know so many girls end up even worse than Ashley did. Never be too trustful around strangers. If you go out together as a group, stay together. Never leave your drink unattended. This could happen to anyone. When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning. So around 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico. And that's when things start to get weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour and still had a few more to drive, and I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, the car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and kind of shrugged it off. A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city. And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper aware of the car and entertained ourselves with watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch the car as it inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed up against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight, it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press his blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over, right in front of the police. Pull over right now, Miguel." And he did, and the car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed and taunted us. The policeman took her claim seriously and told us about how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. And then he offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved. He followed us for about 15 minutes or so. After that, he drove up beside us with his passenger side window down. My dad rolled down his window, and the officer said he was going to get ahead of us and speed up to see if he could find the car that we gave him the description of. We felt like the matter was handled. Worst case scenario, if anyone was up ahead waiting for us, the police officer was going to run into them before we did. But I doubted even that would happen. I knew we were safe, so I began to feel comfortable again and decided I would try to get some sleep. A few minutes went by, and I finally began to fall back asleep. I woke up just moments later when I heard my mom say, "There he is. What is he doing?" My heart almost beat out of my chest when I first heard her say that, thinking she was talking about the car that had been following us an hour earlier. I felt a bit relieved when I looked ahead and saw that the police officer was sitting on the side of the road. "He probably didn't want to drive out of his jurisdiction," said my dad in response. Once we passed by the officer, he pulled out behind us and turned on his lights. My dad pulled over, and we all sat there kind of confused, anticipating what the officer was going to say to us. He walked up to my dad's window, which had already been rolled down once he pulled over. The officer said, "I spoke to the other officers about the vehicle following you. There have been multiple vehicles driven off the road tonight by criminals. The vehicles have been taken, and those inside have been robbed. Some of them have been hurt badly. You guys are very lucky tonight. Up ahead is the area where most of this has been happening. I suggest you guys wait here until the sun comes up." My dad agreed with the officer, as we were all sure he knew best. The officer said that my siblings and I should wait in the back of his car with him so we would be safe. My parents, although somewhat hesitant, agreed to go along with what the officer was saying. As we walked to the officer's car, I noticed that it looked like the make and model of most police cars, but it was all white with a single red light on top of it. It didn't have any other markings that you would expect. I found this to be kind of odd, but I wasn't as familiar with the different types of police vehicles in Mexico like I was in the States. Also, I was very young and quite tired at the time. The three of us got into the back of the car. It seemed like just any regular car. Again, I assumed things were just normal and that I didn't know any better anyway. We sat there for about a half an hour. That's when we saw headlights coming towards us from the opposite direction. As the car grew close, we saw the officer begin to flag the car down. It wasn't until the car turned off the road near us that we realized it was the same car that had been following us from the beginning. I was waiting for the officer to take action against whoever this was, but instead, once the car came to a stop, the officer jogged over to the driver's window of the car. He spoke to whoever was in the car, and then headed towards my parents who were still in their car. This is the part where things became extremely crazy. My dad is a very calm person. Even in very crazy circumstances, he's the one person that doesn't freak out. He's also extremely prepared and super organized. My mom has even criticized him in the past for doing things that she considered unnecessary preparations. I'm very happy that he was never swayed by that and continued to be prepared. This was definitely the most intense situation we've been in as a family. Anyway, the officer began heading towards my parents' car. His entire demeanor had changed. He had one hand on his hip and was yelling at my parents to get out of their car. My siblings and I began to freak out as we had no clue what was going on. As the man got closer to my parents, my dad knew exactly what was happening. I saw him step out of the car, draw his own pistol that he has a permit to carry, and fire a shot at the man. At this point, we saw the other car peel off, and my siblings and I all put our heads down and huddled together. The rest is what I was told from my mom and dad. My dad knew we were getting carjacked, possibly worse. He knew he had to protect all of us. Out of fear for our lives, he decided he would be the one to fire first. My dad shot the man posing as an officer in the leg. This immediately incapacitated the man and sent who was ever in the car on the run. He had made sure the man had no more access to a weapon, held him down, and called emergency services. Because my dad remained calm and was prepared with a pistol and a cell phone that had service in Mexico, he was able to prevent us from sustaining any harm. The real authorities showed up. They arrested the fake officer. This part I saw. They were extremely angry with him and even roughed him up with some kicks and blows from a club, despite him already being injured. My dad talked with the officers for quite some time. Apparently, posing as a police officer is one of the countless tactics desperate criminals in Mexico will try. It looked like we were driven directly into a trap of some sort. My dad saved all of us. I am extremely grateful to this day. I have no clue what those men would have done to us if we weren't prepared. Our visit with family was nice, although we were still on edge from what we had went through. We took only main highways home, despite the fact it took us longer to get there. Ever since this experience, when visiting family in Mexico, we fly down there. If we need a car, we rent one. We found out the hard way that driving through certain parts of Mexico with US plates puts a giant target on our backs. I've tried to learn from this to always be prepared. You don't know when someone is going to try to do something bad to you.